Welcome everyone to the Hamilton City Schools 2024 organizational meeting. It is Thursday, January 11th, 2024. Please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance.
United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
I'll now call the roll. Mrs. Baker?
Here.
Mr. Davidson?
Here.
Dr. Kopus?
Here.
Mrs. Matthews?
Here.
Mr. Sprague?
Here.
I'll now administer the oath of office to Pastor Shack and Dr. Kopus. Please raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear that you will support the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the State of Ohio, and that you will faithfully and impartially discharge your duties as members of the Board of Education of the Hamilton City School District, Butler County, Ohio, to the best of your ability and in accordance with the laws now in effect and hereafter to be enacted during your continuance in said office and until your successor is elected and qualified?
I do.
Congratulations.
Yeah.
Please raise your right hand. You solemnly swear that you will support the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the State of Ohio, and that you will faithfully and impartially discharge your duties as members of the Board of Education of the Hamilton City School District, Butler County, Ohio, to the best of your ability and in accordance with the laws now in effect and hereafter to be enacted during your continuance in said office and until your successor is elected and qualified.
I do.
Welcome back.
Thank you.
I make a motion that we appoint Jeremy Fraser President Pro Tem for the election of President.
I'll second that.
Thank you, Mr. Davidson. Second by Ms. Baker. Any discussion? Now call the roll. Mrs. Baker?
Here.
Mr. Davidson?
Here, or yes.
Dr. Kopus?
Here.
Yes.
Yes.
Mrs. Matthews?
Yes.
Mr. Sprague?
Yes.
Yes.
Very good.
Mr. President,
I'll now need a motion, or at this time I'll need a nomination for board president.
Mr. President, or President Pro Tem,
Yes.
I make a nomination of Mrs. Matthews for President for the Board of Education for the year 2024.
Okay.
Do we need a second?
We don't need a second. We can call the vote as long as there's only one nomination out there. Is there any discussion?
I'd like to make a motion for Mrs. Baker to be president.
Okay. So if there are two nominations on the floor, the way that is handled per Robert's Rules of Order is that the treasurer will call a roll vote and each member will vote for who they want to be president. Mr. Sprague?
Is there a discussion first?
Sure, we can have discussion, absolutely.
Last year, we had a meeting of the board. There had been a few years where they had a president serve 2 years in a row. At that time of our meeting, Mrs. Baker indicated she was going to do it for 1 year and 1 year only. And in fact, we had two meetings, because the first meeting, we had one thing set up, and then we had to change it later. And we all agreed that it would be a 1 year term, and that whoever was vice president would move on and be president the following year. And that's why I nominated Mrs. Matthews per that agreement we had last year. And now, you know, I'm hearing that people don't want to abide with what they agreed to, which affected votes last year. And I just think that's terrible. I think Mrs. Matthews is ready to be president. She'll do an excellent job, and she'll represent the district tremendously.
Any further discussion?
I have a comment. I, of course, was not here last year, but I was at least made privy that that was the agreement that was made. Now, I would tell you, I'm not necessarily in favor of promising anyone a position a year in advance, but I understand that's tradition on school boards where you move from vice president to president. I also want to be honest and tell you that I did have some concerns about Miss Matthews being in that role, and I think she'll confirm this. She and I did have a private conversation where we discussed some of those things. And even though I think today those largely go unresolved, despite that, I was and still am prepared to support her in that role if that's what she chooses to do.
I guess what I'll say is that I agree with you, Dr. Kopis. You know, meetings, things change. And in trying to stay with where we had been as far as going 2 years at a time, and continuing that, you know, I rethought that position earlier this year. I am perfectly happy to serve as the president again, but that's the will of the board, so.
President Pro Temp, I have one question, and I'm not, Ms. Matthews, I'm not trying to put you on the spot here, but I'm going to put you on the spot. Do you want to be board president, or do you not want to be board president?
For me, it's always been definitely an honor to be able to serve and be able to represent the board in that capacity, for sure, absolutely. But at the end of the day, I want to make sure that there's confidence amongst the whole board, and that, you know, this is to be something that could be peacefully done, and everybody can be on the same page. So that is my goal. And again, whomever, you know, everyone feels comfortable in voting for.
So is that a yes or no?
It is a not like this. That's what it is. It's a not like this.
Okay.
Any further discussion before I call the roll?
But I'll be happy to represent however the board would vote. I'll be able to be willing and able and feel confident in serving in any capacity. So.
Okay, I'll now call the roll. And what I'll need you to do is indicate which of the two members you would like for board presidents, not a yay or nay vote on this particular one.
May I say one more thing?
Sure.
This past year, Mrs. Baker has served very well, and this is my motion for Mrs. Baker is no reflection on Reverend Matthews whatsoever. It is all, they have formed a really good team, those two working together. This is no surprise, my recommendation is no surprise to Mrs. Matthews. But over the past year, both Mrs. Baker and Reverend Pastor Shack have worked very well together. And so that is why I recommended this. We have had a tradition here for the past, as long as I've been on board, that we've had 2-year terms, and not 2-year terms, but we just renewed president and vice president for 2 years. It seems to have worked, and I know we had discussions, but things do change. And that's why I made the recommendation for Mrs. Baker, made the motion for Mrs. Baker.
Just one further thing. You all know I was on the school board prior to you being on. 25 years prior to me coming on, it was one-year terms. It gave everybody a chance that if they wanted to be in a leadership role as president, a chance to do it. So it was one-year terms. My vote for my nomination of Mrs. Matthews is not a reflection on Mrs. Baker. It's just that we discussed this, that's how we were going to move forward. And if there were reservations about it or a difference of opinion earlier in the term, that should have been brought to everybody's attention, not a week before the election of a new president.
Any further discussion? Okay, I'll now call the roll. Mr. Sprague.
Mrs. Baker.
Mrs. Baker.
Mrs. Baker.
Mr. Davidson.
Pastor Shack?
Mrs. Matthews.
Ms. Baker.
Dr. Kopus.
Well, before I give a name here, I'm going to say, I realize I'm relatively inexperienced on the board, but my knowledge of the board is that most of the time it has been one-year terms. My personal belief is that should continue. And I realize this is a mute vote, but I would support Ms. Matthews.
Motion carries for Mrs. Baker as board president.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Sprague. Thank you, Mrs. Matthews. I appreciate both comments from Dr. Kopus and Mr. Davidson. Going along with that tradition, as far as the two-year term, I would like to nominate Mrs. Matthews as vice president of the board.
I'd like to second that.
I would like to nominate Mr. Davidson as vice president of the board.
Mrs. Baker, same rules apply for two nominations on the floor, discussion, and then a roll call vote where each individual member will name their pick for vice president.
Well, my point of discussion would be, I think Mr. Sprague recently was in the two roles of vice president and did a great job as president during the COVID time. Ms. Matthews has stated earlier, just a moment ago, that she does not want to be president. I respect that. We have a gentleman down here that's been a successful attorney for 35 plus years. He is skilled in the arts of debate and negotiation, and I trust in his judgment and leadership. That's why I made the nomination.
I think that in regard to Mrs. Matthews, I don't think that she was saying that she is not interested in being at some point in the president's chair. I think that she said that she just didn't want to do it as it has happened. I think as we move on with tradition, obviously, Mrs. Matthews, who everybody has said here would be very capable of managing and being president of the board, I would anticipate that she would be nominated for the board president next year at this time.
My comment was, if she's not ready now and something would happen to Mrs. Baker, she'd be elevated to the role of president. So she's not, it's like the second command.
She didn't say that she wasn't
I
ready.
haven't finished.
Sure.
Please. She said she didn't want it right now, and, you know, that's why she voted for you, or for Mrs. Baker for president. And if something would happen tonight, be elevated to the role of president.
And I would be fine with that.
She wasn't.
Yeah, I stated that I didn't want the presidency like this, not stating no lack of capability to be able to fulfill the job and be extremely successful, but it was just saying not like this, under these terms.
Ms. Matthews, a question. I just want to be clear. What terms are you talking about? What terms are you referring to?
Go ahead.
Well, and I mean, maybe a better way to ask the question would be, if you do not want the presidency of the board, why do you want the vice presidency?
Well, to answer your question, I think for me, I just felt like this process has been very interesting, and just for some personal reasons, I feel like just not like this, and I feel like this is the best route for me at this time, and with being vice president, it'll allow me to continue to there's always room for learning and growth. So I'm looking forward to learning and growing some more, and continuing to represent this district in this capacity of hopefully vice president, and continuing to work towards that, and looking forward to hopefully representing next year, of earning your vote and confidence to serve as in that capacity on next year.
Any more discussion? Mr. Frazier?
Dr. Kopus?
Mr. Davidson?
Mrs. Matthews?
Mrs. Matthews.
Mrs. Baker?
Mrs. Matthews?
Mr. Davidson?
Mr. Davidson?
Mr. Sprague?
Mrs. Matthews.
Okay, thank you very much. Again, thank you for all your comments. Next on the agenda is the establishment of the 2024 meeting dates for the Board of Education. Section 3313.15 of the Ohio Revised Code requires the Board of Education to determine a time for holding its regular meetings. The regular meetings shall be held at least once every 2 months. Commencing January 1st, 2024, the Hamilton City School District's Board of Education regular meetings shall be held on the dates and times provided to each individual in attendance. All information is available on the district website and the board docs agenda. All regular meetings are scheduled to take place at 533 Dayton Street, Hamilton, Ohio, 45012, unless otherwise noted. The president may change the meeting times and place by notifying the treasurer, who shall immediately post the change and inform the media. Special meetings may be called by the president, treasurer, or any two Board of Education members by serving a signed, written notice of the time, location, and purpose of the special meeting at least 2 days before such meeting, in compliance with Section 3313.16 of the Ohio Revised Code. I need a motion to approve.
I'll make that motion.
Thank you, Mrs. Matthews. I need a second.
Second.
Thank you, Mr. Sprague. Mr. Frazier?
Can I ask a question? What are we voting on?
It's the school district calendar.
Oh,
The calendar, board meetings.
Board meetings, yeah,
It doesn't say when we're having board meetings.
because it's posted that Mr., I believe he gave that out.
It's on the board docs.
Yeah, it's on board docs.
It's also on the board doc agenda.
Oh, okay, because we never discussed what, as a
Yeah,
board, and that's part of the organizational meeting, to agree on dates and times.
right, because, and last year, I believe that we posted those before we had the meeting, and I believe, Mr. Davidson, you had an exception to that, so that's why it's not posted out there until we approve it, but it is on board docs tonight for approval. So the actual times and places of the board meetings are out there.
Okay. I still, again, would like to see us move to Wednesday nights.
All right, Mr. Frazier.
Mrs. Matthews?
Yes.
Mr. Sprague?
Yes.
Mrs. Baker?
Yes.
Mr. Davidson?
No.
Dr. Kopus?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, next on the agenda, we need a nomination from the Board of Education member to represent City Planning Commission. I need a motion, please.
Move for Mr. Davidson to be on that.
I need a second.
I second that.
Okay, any discussion? Mr. Frazier?
Mr. Sprague?
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. Davidson,
Yes.
Dr. Kopus,
Yes.
Mrs. Matthews.
Yes.
While we're on the subject of planning commission, they are requesting that we elect an alternate. And the reason they're doing that is there's been a couple of meetings where every member of the planning commission should have an alternate. I think I only missed 2 meetings all of last year, and one of them I was with the city of Hamilton up in Columbus, and we missed it. And that's when I really needed an alternate, because they were looking for alternates to have a meeting.
I think I agreed to serve in that
All
capacity
right, so
for you last year.
If you're willing to do that again?
Sure.
All right, so Jeremy will need to send them that you are the alternate and her phone number and email address.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Davidson. Okay, next on the agenda, we have the nomination for one of our members to serve the next 3-year term as the district representative on the Butler Tech Board of Technology. I would like to nominate Pastor Shack. She has served in that capacity for the last 3 years.
Did you say Board of Technology or Board of Education?
Butler Technology Board of Education.
Okay.
So Butler Tech.
Okay.
Motion, I need a second.
I can second that.
Thank you, Mr. Sprague. Mr. Frazier? Any discussion? Okay, Mr. Frazier?
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. Davidson,
Yes.
Dr. Kopus,
Yes.
Mrs. Matthews,
Yes.
Mr. Sprague.
Yes.
Okay, next on the agenda is establishing Board of Education member compensation. I need a motion.
Madam President, I would move that we forego any compensation as a board.
Okay, thank you. A second.
I second that.
Mr. Kopus. I'd just like to make a comment myself. According to the current policy under the bylaws, number 147, it states actually that board members shall not receive compensation. So really, the voting of this is somewhat of a moot point since it's already in policy. I just would like to bring out to the board the possibility of at some point in the future looking at that and potentially may change that to may rather than shall, to give a little bit of leeway for future boards. And I did some research, and I believe that we are the only district in the county that does not compensate our board members. Just making a suggestion.
Yeah, I think the statute provides for compensation, so our
does.
bylaws cannot trump the statute. And that's why I believe it's on here for us to vote to not take compensation.
Okay, so, but I think we do need to change our policy.
There's a lot of things in our policies that need change.
Okay. So anyway, that's what I had for discussion. We have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? Okay.
Mr. Davidson,
Yes.
Dr. Kopus,
Yes.
Mrs. Matthews,
Yes.
Mr. Sprague,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Yes. Next on the agenda, it is a recommendation. It's recommended that the Board of Education establish a service fund beginning July 1st, 2024 for $20,000 for the fiscal year 2025 to provide the Board of Education members' expenses according to Section 3313.15 of the Ohio Revised Code. I need a motion.
So moved.
Thank you, Mr. Davidson. Second.
Second.
Thank you, Mrs. Matthews. Any discussion?
Jeremy, how much came out of the board fund last year? Approximately, I'm not gonna.
I don't know that we had anything off the top of my head come out of the board fund, because typically the conference that you all would go to would be Capital Conference, and I don't believe we had any attendees for that last year.
So what happens to the money that was placed in it last year?
It's just a budgeted line item within the general fund. So it's just in the general fund cash balance. It's not like it gets allocated anywhere else. It sits there as a budgeted line item. If it's used, fine. If it's not used, fine as well.
Is that where the OSBA dues would come from?
No, that is a different line item.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, Mr. Frazier?
Dr. Kopus,
Yes.
Mrs. Matthews,
Yes.
Mr. Sprague,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. Davidson.
Yes.
Okay, next on the agenda, the approving of our consultant agreement with OSBA. Whereas the Hamilton City School District of Education wishes to support the efforts of other boards of education to obtain favorable judicial decisions, and whereas the Ohio School Board Association Legal Assistance Fund has been established for this purpose. Therefore, the board hereby resolves to enter into a consultant agreement with the OSBA Legal Assistance Fund for 2024 and directs the treasurer to pay the Legal Assistance Fund $250 for the annual consulting fee. I need a motion, please.
So moved.
Thank you, Mr. Sprague. Thank you, Mr. Davidson. Any discussion? Mr. Frazier?
Mrs. Matthews,
Yes.
Mr. Sprague,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. Davidson,
Yes.
Dr. Kopus.
Yes.
Okay, next on the agenda is the district legal counsel representation. It is recommended that the Board of Education approve the continued use of Bricker Graydon as its primary legal counsel for the 2024 calendar year. I need a motion.
So moved.
Thank you. Second?
Second.
Thank you. Ms. Matthews? Any discussion?
I have a point I want to make.
Sure.
I made a phone call this morning to Mr. Frazier, and because I had several questions about our affiliation with Bricker and Graydon, and I would say not only did he answer every question I had, he educated me greatly on that relationship, so I applaud him for that. So Jeremy, you did a great job. I appreciate your help.
We appreciate Jeremy, that's for sure. Thank you, Mr. Frazier. Anything else?
Yeah, Jeremy, my understanding is we don't have a contract per se with them, correct?
We sign them up as our legal counsel, and I believe there is a board vote on that. Originally, when that was done, I believe that was done sometime in 2018, either mid to late 2018, at the very latest, early
It was done
19.
it was done in June of 18.
Okay.
So is it a written document?
So there, we would probably have something attached on board docs. I can go back and look through that if anybody would like to see it.
I'd
Absolutely.
like to see it.
Sure.
And at some point in the near future, if you can let me know how much we spent on legal fees last year?
Absolutely. Yeah, I can get that
And
together.
then how do they bill, monthly or?
So they bill us monthly based on time spent. And that was one of Dr. Kopus's questions as well regarding retainer and those types of things. So if we don't use them in a given month, we do not get a bill.
So if I want to see an invoice for the month, you would have that?
Absolutely.
All right, thank you.
Any further discussion? Mr. Frazier?
Mr. Sprague,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. Davidson,
Yes.
Dr. Kopus,
Yes.
Mrs. Matthews.
Yes.
Okay, next on the agenda is our tax budget. Mr. Frazier, I believe I need to refer to you, please.
Thank you, Mrs. Baker. The tax budget, it's basically a document that we create every single year, and it is a document that is required to be filed with the Butler County Budget Commission, which contains reps from the auditor, the county treasurer, and the county prosecutor. And basically what they do is they review the document so that they can do their job in certifying that we do need tax revenues to operate. It's a document that takes a lot of work. I believe you all have seen it. I sent it to you with a one-page description that if you were having trouble sleeping that night, that would be something good to read. But it's about a 12 to 18 page document full of what we expect our revenues and expenditures to be and what they have been over the past couple years. But again, it's It's a document that we approve every year. We're required to approve it. It takes a lot of work, and it's something that we will not look at again until next organizational meeting.
Okay. I need a motion to approve the tax budget.
I'll make that motion.
Thank you, Mrs. Matthews.
Second.
Thank you, Mr. Davidson. Any further discussion?
I have a comment. Again, I'm going to give kudos to Mr. Frazier. He did send that information out 2+ weeks ago, gave us all a chance to review it. I did review it all. I understood about 10% of it, but I did call and question him, and he answered my questions again. So Jeremy, again, you did an excellent job on that. I appreciate that.
And I
Thank
do agree with you, it is a good sleep aid.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Dr. Kopus. So we need you to call the roll?
Yep. Mrs. Baker?
Yes.
Mr. Davidson?
Yes.
Dr. Kopus?
Yes.
Mrs. Matthews?
Yes.
Mr. Sprague?
Yes.
Okay, that's the end of our organizational meeting. Our next meeting, which is on the 25th, January 25th, it is a work session and regular meeting, work session. I'm sorry, I didn't,
Right now, we originally have a work session, executive session, and a business meeting scheduled for that evening.
okay. So the executive session, I believe, would start, or work session starts at 4.
That's correct, yes.
Correct, okay. I don't think we've got anything further, so I
Do
need,
we adjourn?
yes, you may move that we adjourn. I need a second?
I'll second.
Okay, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you very much.